the board, Christ Lutheran School in Sterling, Illinois. He is going to be adjuncting in Hebrew in the future semester at Concordia, Chicago. He's a PhD candidate at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion in Cincinnati, and he will be not teaching, well, I guess he will kind of teach you about Hebrew, but instead, he'll be teaching Latin and other languages the Lutheran way. Please welcome with me, Reverend Fischaber.
The early modern period was a time of numerous reformations across many different aspects of society. While the Lutheran Reformation was first and foremost a matter of theology, it had a profound impact on law, education, science, and many other fields undergoing reformations at the same time, even as they also affected. For example, without the printing press, the Reformation would have looked very different. Without the protection of sacks and dukes, Luther's time might have been much, much shorter. Meanwhile, without Luther, the printing press would look nothing like it does today, and the theological Reformation had many impacts on law. The educational Reformation was extremely closely tied to the theological one, though it started earlier with the humanists. A full history of all the changes would take far too long, but these had a profound impact on the educational system that the Lutherans developed. They also drove many of these advancements through their innovations and best practices that we will discuss. These changes were desperately needed. In 1524, Martin Luther painted a stark contrast between education before and after the Reformation in "To the councilmen of all the cities in Germany that they establish and maintain Christian schools." We have today the finest and most learned group of men, adorned with the languages and all the arts, who could also render real service if we would make use of them as instructors of the young people. Is it not evident that we are now able to prepare a boy in 3 years so that at the age of 15 or 18, he will know more than all the universities and monasteries have known before? Indeed, what have men been learning till now in the universities and monasteries, except to become asses, blockheads, and numbskulls? For 20, even 40 years, they pored over their books and still failed to master either Latin or German, to say nothing of the scandalous and immoral life there, in which many a fine young fellow was shamefully corrupted. When Luther wrote this, there were still many more educational improvements to come. One of the great problems with medieval Latin education was that it focused more on philosophical analysis of its syntactical mysteries rather than the rules of grammar. Such abstract linguistic effort is neither useful for learning languages nor in accord with the Lutheran view of education. Phillip, Martin Luther, and their colleagues declared in their 1545 confession the Wittenberg Reformation. It is quite obvious that schools are necessary for preserving Christian doctrine and government, and it would be very useful for many reasons for Christian sensible bishops to have special supervision over the schools. First, so that Christian doctrine may be purely and unanimously taught by the theologians. Secondly, so that from the earliest stages the youth be raised in the arts and languages that are necessary for the explanation of Christian doctrine. Neither this theology of education nor practical considerations permitted the retention of the medieval status quo in regard to language education. Philip Melanchthon, the Praetector Germaniae, would have had an important influence on education regardless of when he lived. But the fact of the matter is, Germany desperately needed a Praetector during this period. And not only he, but many of our Lutheran fathers rose to the challenge and produced significant educational contributions with lasting value for today. However, we must note that despite Luther's high high praise here and elsewhere for the importance and usefulness of Latin, both for individuals and for the broader society, it was not universally taught. There were essentially three different types of schools. The highest level was the Latin school, which will be discussed more below. In it, students spoke and were instructed in Latin. This was where the well-to-do sent their children, and any particularly bright students they sponsored as a preparation for university. There were also vernacular schools wherein instruction took place in the common language of the people. The children of ordinary townfolk and those in the outlying villages would attend these schools. And finally, there were girls' schools, which were largely vernacular as well, though some girls were taught Latin. I probably don't need to persuade any of you of the value of Latin. Rather, it is important for the sake of perspective to remember that modern classical Lutheran education is drawing not on the tradition of ordinary instruction, but rather the highest level of schools which led to university. It certainly remains a great benefit for those in the trades today, and our Lutheran forefathers repeatedly made this clear. However, even Luther and Melanchthon did not expect that everyone would learn. Though you are training students in the way of the elite, remember the warning of St. Paul. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. The point of classical Lutheran education is not to prepare students to serve themselves, like the world says. It is to make them disciples of the one true God, and to train them to serve their neighbor in love. Our Christian vocation must guide and permeate our approach to education. Because we have a theology rather than a philosophy of education, the first suggestion from our Lutheran forefathers must come from the great formulator David XXIII in his Regulae Studiorum. Melanchthon's heir as the chief humanist of the Lutheran Church starts not with great intellectual rigor, but with the exhortation to begin all study with prayer. Because nothing can be done without the help of God, he said each day's study should begin with a pious and ardent petition that the Son of God, the Logos, the fount of all wisdom and salutary doctrine, should teach, guide, and aid us so that our work in the Lord does not go in vain. You can see the prayer which I will begin my Hebrew classes with. Purely classical education will fall just as certainly as Greece and Rome did. Even Cicero's great ethical teachings were not enough to preserve their societies. Far more importantly, the classics without Christ will lead to hell just as certainly as the worst modern ideologies. We must have classical Lutheran education if we are going to truly succeed. Religion is not an extra subject in the curriculum. It must permeate all we do, so as you labor under the curse of Babel and in every other aspect of education, pray God's blessing upon your work. Turning now to practical considerations, our second suggestion actually comes from a non-Lutheran. Though he was Melanchthon's great uncle and an early supporter of Luther, Germany's great humanist Johannes Reuchlin rejected the Lutheran Reformation. Nevertheless, his impact on language education was profound and had lasting influence on the Lutherans. David Price argues, while Reuchlin has gone down in history as the father of Christian Hebrew philology, he has not received adequate recognition as a primal force behind the meteoric rise of Greek studies in Northern Europe. He also gave Greek humanism a meaningful compass, one with its orientation pointing to the ancient Christian writings, even as it navigated the wider sea of classical culture. May we all follow not just Reuchlin, but our Lutheran forefathers' orientation in regard to classical studies. However, I want to look not at patristics and classics, but at his Hebrew pedagogy. De Rudimentis Hebraicus is highly regarded for introducing the study of Hebrew to Europe. Prior to its publication, the only way to learn Hebrew was to hire a Jew or a convert from Judaism to teach you. However, despite its great historical importance, it is a very strange work. Even though it has no Hebrew basis whatsoever, he conjugates nouns according to Latin, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative cases. This linguistic absurdity enabled Latin and Greek speakers to learn Hebrew on their own. This first step led to all the subsequent development of Christian Hebraism. So the second suggestion is to teach to your students and what they already know. You are not teaching classics graduate students and should not act like it. Obviously, don't teach them something that must be unlearned because it is wrong. But draw heuristic connections to English, or if you have the right demographics, Spanish or some other language. Your student can always continue on and learn more. And would that they would, for very many works deserve translating. But if it is not made accessible to them, they will never want to. Give them a foundation they are able and desire to build upon. That is far more productive than following the table of contents of Gildersleeve and Lodge, the standard English language Latin reference grammar. Related to this is the suggestion to teach Latin alongside English. Polyglot grammars were very common. For example, Peter Artokoeus published Latinae, Graecae, et Hebraicae Linguae Grammatica, a grammar of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew written in Latin. He discusses Babel and the need to learn all the biblical and theological languages, but he gives the most attention in his introduction to Hebrew, as the least well known. Each language is taught in its own booklet, and then the book of Jonah and selected psalms are presented in all three languages with a commentary. The book seems more given to learning each language sequentially, rather than covering one grammatical part of each. However, the end goal to know and use them together is made clear even from the introduction. Elias Hutter was perhaps the most innovative linguist of the period. Near the end of the 16th century, he founded a language school in Nuremberg to teach Latin, German, Greek, and Hebrew over 4 years as a preparation for pastoral education. He published numerous works in support of this training. His Restitutio Methodia Linguarum, Alphabetum, Dictionarium Harmonicum Biblicum, and other works teach all 4 languages together and explain how they are similar and different from one another. This approach prevents students from forgetting the first language while they learn the second, and learning not merely how Latin works, but how 4 languages all work, and how they are similar and different from one another, teaches each language in a far greater depth than merely learning one on its own. After all, how many times have you heard someone say, "I never really understood English grammar until I learned another language"? This is my preferred method for teaching Latin in classical schools, especially in ones where it is being introduced. There are not hordes of parents beating down school board doors demanding Latin be taught. You're far more likely to hear that Latin is useless, or at least not important enough to have a place in the curriculum with everything else that has to be taught. Teachers at transitioning schools have to be persuaded of its value for whatever subject or grade level they teach. And even long-established classical schools likely have to keep selling parents on the value of Latin. Why not spend time on Spanish or something else that will help them get into college or compete for top jobs? outside English grammar, you will provide a high and very quick return on the effort invested in teaching. When test scores go through the roof and students are far ahead of their peers at other schools, you will have proven Latin's worth. When science goes much faster, because students already know what the terms mean, its value across the board will be clear. Students, teachers, and parents will see for themselves the reason for the improvement, and that Latin is not just a world to itself of dusty old books. A useful example of this method is Norma Goldman's English Grammar for Students of Latin. This companion to your Latin textbook provides a useful bridge between the two languages and short exercises comparing them. In addition to letting them see their progress, the way to persuade students to continue building on the foundation of Latin they learn in class is to make it enjoyable. Luther admonishes teachers, when Christ wished to train men, he had to become a man. If we are to train children, then we must become children with them. Playing himself on the double meaning of ludus, both as a school for elementary instruction and as play, he says, would God that such child's play would be well done. In a short time we would see a great treasure trove of Christian people. Melanchthon also advised variety and even music in education to prevent tedium and exhausting students. Fun is a loaded word, as it is frequently set in opposition to actual education. No one should waste school time on frivolous amusements, but as the great reformer himself admonishes, learning is most effective when it is a delight. The fifth suggestion comes from Elias Hutter. Graphically delineate parts of words. In his Biblia Sacra Derech HaKodesh and his Alphabetum, he prints the Hebrew words in a special font he invented with solid root letters and hollow prefixes and suffixes. As you can see from the polyglot 10 Commandments in the Alphabetum, even if you don't know Hebrew, you can easily tell what the roots are. The Latin, German, and Greek require knowledge of the language to determine that. This is particularly well suited to Semitic languages and triliteral roots. I will be using it with my Hebrew students. However, it will benefit Latin and other language students as well. Hutter created his own typeface, but this can be done simply and monochromatically with italics or underlining. However, if your school does not mind the color copies, or when displayed on your computer or chalkboard, I recommend multicolor writing. Amo, amas, ama, etc. You see the black root and the personal ending in green. The parts are clear and very easily understood. If we move to the imperfect, amabam, amabas, amabat, etc., with the root still in black, the personal ending in green, and now the imperfect indicator in purple. This clearly shows what is happening with the language. Have 3 different students write the paradigm on the board, each taking a different color. Even though the one with the root will have the easiest time, it will teach them all to think about the constitutive parts of the words in a way copying paradigms repeatedly cannot. And this can be applied to other parts of speech as well. In Principio creavit Deus caelum et terram, you see the noun roots and their endings as well as the verbs. Or take it a step further and give the preposition and conjunctions their own color too. There are many possibilities with this. Have your students take colored pencils and write Genesis 1:1 from memory, or copy it from a black text in the appropriate colors. Paradigms only exist on paradigm charts. This method clearly shows the important parts of paradigms and lets you place them into real texts. However, do make extensive use of charts. This might not seem like that significant of a suggestion, in an age when full-color posters of most anything you could teach are widely available at reasonable prices. However, our forefathers put out the effort to do this in an age of movable type. Following the preface of his Annotationes in Grammaticam, Melanchthon includes a fold-out chart of anomalous Latin forms. Throughout his Grammatices Latinae Elementa, he has numerous charts and tables laying out word forms, meters, and other aspects of Latin. He did this at the cost of tremendous typesetting effort and the majority of some pages being left blank. These are not decorations to cover your classroom walls and make it look pretty. Melanchthon used them in his books as serious aids for learning to help those studying Latin to learn it better. Since they have been mentioned already, our next suggestion from our Lutheran forebearers is to use polyglots. Lutherans were the largest producers of Christian Hebrew liturgical works. Most of these were polyglot lectionaries, prayer books, or catechisms. Luther's Alphabetum has the Commandments, Creed, Lord's Prayer, and the scriptural texts of the sacraments in its 4 languages without Luther's explanation. Johannes Claius published the entire small catechism in German, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Many Lutherans prepared polyglot lectionaries, and in a particularly ambitious polyglot, Martin Chemnitz's nephew, Phillip, published the first 21 articles of the Augsburg Confession and the 3 ecumenical creeds in German, Latin, and Hebrew. And this does not have to be printed in multiple languages. If students have the Lord's Prayer memorized in English, they have, for lack of a better term, a mental polyglot when they read it in Latin. In his 1528 instruction for the visitors of parish pastors in electoral Saxony, Luther advised, they shall first learn to read the primer in which are found the alphabet, the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and other prayers. Philip Melanchthon provides such a work in his Elementa Querilia. It gives the alphabet, vowels, and diphthongs, followed immediately by the Lord's Prayer, the Sermon on the Mount, other important biblical texts, and concludes with wise sayings. This also served to build vocabulary and teach the theological and moral content of these passages. It is far easier to remember vocabulary that is used than what is memorized on flashcards to regurgitate on a text. You can read through Gildersleeve and Lodge until you reach section 626, explanatory relative. And this would be very rigorous and noble endeavor. Or, you can teach your students the Lord's Prayer in Latin. Pater Noster qui es in caelis, since Pater Noster means our Father, a little prompting will lead your students to figure out that qui es in caelis means, in the same word order even, who art in heaven, with a comparable clause to the English. Here it is not the Latin grammar aiding the understanding of English, but the other way around. Furthermore, as those of you who have taught Latin before can attest, children tend to find being able to pray or sing things in Latin they already know really cool. Some academics like to criticize the use of translated works instead of original Latin compositions as inferior for learning. But the Lutheran humanists, who knew Greek and Latin far better than they ever will, found them useful and integrated them into their schools. Your students will benefit just like theirs. In a similar vein, music was used extensively to teach Latin. Christopher Boyd Brown has written on this for the city of Joachimsthal in his book Singing the Gospel, Lutheran Hymns and the Success of the Reformation. But this was not limited to merely theology and hymnody. Brown writes, the widespread use of music in Joachimsthal's schools both reflected and supported the broader academic, religious, and disciplinary goals of the town's pedagogues, who used music to teach Latin, to convey the religious truths of the Lutheran gospel, and to present their lessons to their students in as painless and memorable a way as possible. There is much to unpack here, and several other sessions will address teaching theology through music. So how did our Lutheran forebearers use music to teach Latin? First off, singing the liturgy in Latin functions like a mental polyglot. Our Father who art in heaven, pater noster qui es in celis. Especially when the music can stay the same, it is very easy to memorize the texts in English and Latin. Repetition and memorization are essential, and music is a tremendous aid to this. Credo in unum Deum, Patrem omnipotentem, Tractorum coeli et terrae, visibilium omnium et invisibilium is going to take a bit longer to memorize. And the same is true in English. My 2- and 3-year-old sons, dozens of times each day, will hold up a toy and sing, "This is the gospel of the Lord, praise be to thee, O Christ." I believe one God, Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, all things visible and invisible. They're only about halfway through the second article. Even though they hear this creed straight from TLH every Sunday, it's harder to memorize. And this isn't because of the length. They have lots of hymns memorized that they do not hear anywhere close to once a week, like the Nicene Creed, because the music makes it so much easier. In addition to the liturgy, students can memorize the original Latin of hymns. For example, sing stanza 1 of the Father's Love Begotten in Latin in your Christmas concert, followed by the whole hymn in English. If students memorize Latin texts, they will feel accomplished and much more comfortable with the language. One hymn stanza or piece of the liturgy is not that much work. Ask the 3-year-olds in your congregation. I hope your students are used to having to memorize much more than that anyway. But it will have a tremendous benefit. If I can sing or say the table prayer in Latin, it can't be that hard. If I've done this much, I can definitely figure out more Latin. That is what you want them to think. Furthermore, it has that wow factor that will impress parents and others who come to chapel or concerts. Now, not all hymns in translation are close to the original due to the limitations of meter, and generally the changes aren't improvements. That is a burden we must bear from the curse of Babel. But it is also an opportunity for us. Johann Mathesius admonished his students in Joachim's Tal to explain the Latin texts to their parents at home. If your students are at a sufficiently high level, you can work through a hymn text and show how the Latin original differs from the translation. You can likely find literal translations of the hymns online if you need help with the poetic usages. But these do not have to be in-depth and technical syntactical differences. The content itself is noteworthy. To use a Spanish example, you can look at LSB 502, Holy Spirit, the dove sent from heaven. The original text is printed after the English hymn. Stanza 3 in Spanish concludes, "Sanctify us against evil. We, the believers of the world, are one in Jesus through your holy baptismal washing." Sanctification and baptism didn't make it into the English version. But is that richness of the original not worth your students going home and telling their parents about? But music does not have to be in Latin to be beneficial. I can still sing all the Shirley English journals I learned in elementary school. If there are any ready-made ones out there for Latin, I didn't find them, but it is easy enough to write your own. Take the demonstrative hic, for example. Hic huius hui conco, hi horum his hos his, hi huius hui conco, hi horum his has his, ha huius hui conco, hi horum his his his. You can do the same with the other pronouns, your modal verbs, nouns, adjectives, and the like. If this isn't your forte, you can probably find a music person at your school or ask around here. The differences between Latin and English may make it harder to do certain grammatical ones. After all, a sentence in Latin can be one verb. But you can do it for some points, such as to explain the different verb tenses or the functions of cases. Have loved, had loved, will have loved, etc. may be hard for your students to keep straight. But put it into song, and it is much easier to understand and remember the tenses. It will help their English as well. Have a case jingle explaining the six, and another oblative one going into more depth on its different functions. There are lots of ways to play with this, and you can even have your students compose their own. If they have to figure out how to explain it in song, they will be forced to learn it well. And one final note on music is meter and pronunciation. In Joachim's call, Latin diction, in addition to grammar, was taught through music. But I am not concerned with whether you use classical or ecclesiastical pronunciation. Rather, the issue is long and short syllables. Even though they are written the same, some words are different depending on if the vowel is long or short, and not just mispronounced. The neuter nominative and accusative hoc, for example, compared to the ablative hoc. No one likes trying to keep these straight. When I took a Cicero course with the philology PH students at the University of Cincinnati, even they hated the prose meter exam. Very few people read the meter and pronunciation section of Cicero's Orator, or the prosody section of Gildersleeve and Lodge, and for good reason. Most people just find it very tedious and hard to keep track. And the reason for this is that Latin is now a written language. Questions of meter are almost certainly beyond your students. It is something doctoral students find difficult after all. But hoc versus hoc is a very important matter. The same is true with libera and libera. Latin texts properly set to music will support the difference in vowels. If you have students write out paradigms, HOC and HOC look exactly the same. You can make them mark the long vowels, but they will forget that the second you stop requiring it. And if they only ever read marked texts, they will struggle to understand unmarked ones. But jingles will get them to memorize the proper form of HOC and remember it when they read and parse Latin. Before we move on to speaking Latin, instead of just reading it, there is one more suggestion that comes from the citizens of Joachim's Hall themselves. Half of the personal library inventories from the city contain Latin works. However, among these Latin speakers, many prefer to read classical authors in translation. Though one of the great benefits of learning Latin rather than a different foreign language is that it opens you up to that millennial-long culture in a way translation does not. However, that does not mean translation is bad. Do not set English versions of the classics against the originals. Rather, make reading them in Latin an enrichment beyond the still significant value they provide in translation. But let us return to speaking Latin. It was the language of law, international business, and much of theology, among many other things. Fluency was the expected standard. In the Latin schools, the boys spoke it every day and learned it. The exception to this rule was that they also learned German hymn for the benefit of the vernacular-speaking congregation, and had some vernacular exercises for the sake of variety. As a part of this, they were required to translate the Greek and Latin lectionary readings into German. Knowing Latin is not enough. Your students need to be able to communicate in good, colloquial English. Stilted, overly wooden translations may be necessary for your students because of their level, or your need to evaluate them with a precision that might be blurred by a smoother translation. But follow the advice of St. Jerome and keep the end goal to be able to render beautiful Latin in beautiful English. Dr. Preuss will talk more about teaching Latin as a spoken language without sacrificing grammar on Thursday, so I will leave that to him and turn to the topic of speaking Latin as part of the translation process. Though our Lutheran forefathers were amazing innovators in the field of education, they were very conscious of the fact that they were not the first to walk this ground. Though he made significant innovations, Phillip Melanchthon was intentionally building on the tradition inherited from the ancients. In his preface to the Commentary on the Soul, he writes, "For I believe that religion needs to be applied to teaching, in order that we do not wantonly overthrow what has been taught correctly by others, as some believe that it is the greatest success of their intelligence to overturn craftily what others have said correctly." Throughout his works, Melanchthon cites Cicero and other ancient authors. Part of teaching language the Lutheran way is to preserve the best of older pedagogical practices. The 13th suggestion is to have students read the text you are working through out loud, as was the practice in antiquity. In his aforementioned instructions for the visitors, Luther prescribes grammatical instruction for all 3 levels of students. The lowest is to work through the standard Latin grammar of Donatus and the works of Cato. Luther writes, "The schoolmaster is to expound 1 or 2 verses at a time, and the children are to repeat these at a later time, so that they thereby build up a vocabulary of Latin words and get a supply of words for speaking. This practice continues in the highest division. In the morning, Virgil is to be repeated, and in grammar the pupils are to be required to explain, decline, and indicate the various forms of discourse." And this was not limited to the young. In his oration on the study of languages, Melanchthon recounts the story of Reuchlin meeting Johannes Argyropoulos, the most renowned Greek teacher of the day, to see if this German newcomer could handle the rigors of Italian scholarship. Argyropoulos had him read Thucydides aloud in Greek and translate it into Latin. Reuchlin excelled at both of the tasks, to the great surprise of the proud Italians. When David Chytræus was a student in his house, Melanchthon had him read aloud and explain Thucydides as well. Reading aloud engages multiple senses, and if done properly will help students to understand the rhetorical impact and beauty of texts. Reading should not be done in monotony. Teach them to read like the words and phrases actually have meaning. Et dixit, audite ergo domus Dei, numquid parum vobis est molestos esse hominibus, quia molesti estis et Deo meo? Propter hoc David Dominus ipse vobis signum. Ecce, Virgo concipiet et pariet filium et vocabitis nomen eius Emmanuel. Then he said, "Hear now, O house of David, Is it too little for you to weary men, that you also weary my God? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Isaiah spoke the word of the Lord like he actually meant it, not like he was reading the phone book or an instruction manual. If you read Latin like it is boring, your students will believe you. This is one of the reasons Latin plays were an important part of the curriculum. Furthermore, if they can put appropriate force and tone behind the words, they're actually understanding the language and getting so much more out of it. The next suggestion is to read the best literature. Luther, Melanchthon, Chytraeus, and many others provide extensive suggestions for reading. They consider Cicero and Quintilian the best examples of Latin, while Chytraeus advises reading Luther as the chief example of good German. The reading lists of classical authors draws extensively on the suggestions Quintilian gives in his Institutes of Oratory. However, Chytraeus in particular gives much more extensive explanation of what to draw from each text. In addition to lists of good literature, they also cautioned against others. Melanchthon criticized Pliny and the Italian humanist Poliziano for having clever turns of phrase that delighted young readers, but were too frivolous for serious matters. There is a place for reading sentences invented for grammar books, but it will not get you far. You need to read real text to grow in Latin or any other language. These should be the best quality examples for the purpose at hand and the abilities of the students. The final suggestion is not to advance too fast without students mastering the basics. Quintilian and other ancient teachers were very concerned about students being pushed along too quickly without proper comprehension of the previous subjects. Chytraeus repeatedly warned against moving too fast in his Regulae Studiorum. In instructions to the visitors, Luther advises having students in the first division who struggle read through Cato and Donatus' grammar a second time. But it is important to remember that their definition of not moving too fast did not mean learn all of grammar before beginning to read. Being in real Latin as quickly and as much as possible is a good thing. There are a multitude of authors at a wide variety of levels. Chytraeus also recommends beginners start by translating their vernacular language into Latin, rather than the other way around. Prose composition is widely regarded today as one of the best ways to learn higher level grammar and syntax. But Chytraeus would have us use its benefits at the lower level as well. Putting something from English into Latin will make your students truly start to think about Latin in a much deeper way than even translating from Latin into English. Remember, as you choose texts, that you are teaching for your students' benefit and not your own prestige or ego. Luther condemned such schoolmasters as not only useless, but even injurious. Cicero's Veterines are tremendously fun to read, but there is a reason you will find them in the graduate courses of classics departments and not the undergrad ones. The only way your students will ever grow into Cicero is by working through and truly mastering the levels on the way there. If you do that for them, your students will praise you as Cicero did his teacher, the poet Archias. But far more importantly, God will commend you as a good and faithful servant. Education is hard, but but it is very important both for the temporal and spiritual welfare of your students. Martin Luther said, "When schools are growing, then things go well and the church is safe. Let us call more doctors and masters. The young are the seedbed of the church, a fountainhead. When we are dead, where would others like us come from if there were no schools? God has saved the church through schools. Schools preserve the church." There is a reason education is so very prominent in the Bible. God truly cares about what you are doing. Let us take care in each subject to use the best pedagogical practices we can, just as our Lutheran forefathers regularly admonished. God has called you to give your students the very best. Not all of these 15 methods will be suitable for each level, teacher, or class. Prudent judgment, of course, must be applied in all things. But our Lutheran forefathers were true experts in the field of education. They offer us a tremendous treasure trove of excellent suggestions for improving teaching. May they be a blessing to you and your students. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Fischaber. If there are any questions, we've got a couple of minutes to give you time to go to the next one as well as me, because I have to go talk.
Do you have a list of those jingles you mentioned in Latin that we could access on?
I just made it up when I was writing this. Send me an email, I can probably record it for you, but I just made it up as I was going.
When you're talking about using real Latin texts, at what point in the grammar educational stage would you start introducing real Latin? And what would you introduce?
As soon as they can read, as soon as they know enough to read something, I would start introducing it. If you're familiar with Wheelock's Latin, very early on, he has just single sentences taken from ancient authors. Or maybe that's the workbook, it's been a few years.
It's the
book
grammar.
itself.
Yeah.
And then we have someone here with a wide collection of easy Latin texts. Oh, I just met him at lunch, but you want to say
I
something?
sent the list to you. We were talking at lunch. I'm a 35-year Spanish teacher at high school and college level, and I was recruited by my daughter to teach Latin at their homeschool cooperative. So I've learned Latin, and I've learned Latin the way that I teach it and by reading. I have a list that I just sent you. It's over 100 simplified Latin texts, just books. There's Latin authors out there that can write a 1,000-word story with 20 unique words. And as soon as I taught my students the verbs in Latin, some of the useful verbs in Latin, they started reading. I'm talking about the second week of school, they started reading some of those books. And if you're interested, maybe you could
If you
pass it
don't
on, or
catch him before the end of the conference, email me and I'll put you in touch with him.
I assigned my students to read one book a week minimum in Latin. And these little novels that were between 1,000 and 5,000. And they all did it from third grade up to so.
Yes.
Would you approve of that list being put on the CCLE website, and is that something that could be done?
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's above my pay grade, but talk to those two or someone else on the board.
You could also use Donatus as a call and response. So if you look up Donatus, just use the word donate and add a US instead of an E. And his arts minor, it's literally the questions, how many parts of speech are there? Name them. That in Latin. It's the kind of thing that's in English in Memoria Press's forum series. But if you're looking for call and response in grammar, that's what Luther's talking about, is what they were drilled on, were these questions.
Melanchthon wrote one, I think it was Questiones Grammatica, I have to look back at that one, but Donatus was the standard, Melanchthon and many others wrote their own.
Also free.
Public domain is a wonderful thing. Any other questions?
Thank you.